Winter. In the election of 1987, the Tory vote in Scotland fell off a cliff. They lost more than half their MPs, but they won again in England. 3 times in a row, Scotland had rejected the Conservatives at the ballot box, and 3 times in a row they stayed in power anyway. The national question, who has the right to run Scotland, which had been quietly put to sleep in 1979, was back.
I remember very early on I was at a social gathering involving senior civil servants in the Scottish office, and the then permanent secretary was sort of quite keen to find out what was I thinking. So he said to me, what's the big issue? What do you see the big issue is going to be in the period ahead? And I said the question of the democratic structure in Scotland, the right of Scotland to be able to make most of the important decisions in Scotland. And he said, maybe I'll better dust off the file and have a look at it. So even the permanent secretary of the Scottish office at that stage, and that's maybe 1986, had not thought that the issue would come back very soon.
This is where the old Scottish Parliament met in the 17th and early 18th centuries. And not far from here is the old Royal High School, which was to have housed the new devolved assembly that the Labour government of the 1970s tried and failed to set up. So it came to be said that Scotland was the only country in Europe that had 2 parliament buildings and no parliament. In the 1980s, this missing parliament came to be known as the democratic deficit, and more people in Scotland argued that Conservative policies were not just unpopular, they were actually illegitimate in a country that had repeatedly voted against them in elections. And the idea began to take hold among anti-Tory Scots that Scotland wasn't just a separate political realm, it was a separate moral realm as well, more caring, more egalitarian, less acquisitive, less, in a word, Tory.
I think within Scotland there always has been, and to an extent there still is, although it's perhaps diluted, eroded now to some extent, a strong sense of social justice, of communal responsibility, of civil society, the kind of feature of a kind of small country looking out for one another.
There was a poll the other day which looked at attitudes towards things like equality, personal freedom, and so on. And they could register no difference at all between the English and the Scots, almost none. Nevertheless, if you put it in a kind of national context, you throw a light of how do you as a Scot feel about this, that and the other, then it begins to change. I mean, what certainly is true is that Scotland has a much greater belief in the importance of equality.
In Mrs. Thatcher's 3rd term, these ideas of the democratic deficit and of Scotland's moral distinctness welded themselves into a force that almost the whole of Scotland could rally round. The political parties, the local authorities, the churches, the trade unions, civil society, everyone except the governing party, united to form a constitutional convention. Home Rule, dormant for nearly a decade, was up and out again. The clamour of Mrs. Thatcher's 3rd consecutive election victory in England and the discord of a 3rd consecutive defeat in Scotland had shaken it awake.
All the Labour MPs, all the Liberal Democrat MPs, they all went to the founding meeting of the Constitutional Convention and said, thus far and no further. And I mean, if you look at the image of that meeting now, I mean, everyone, I mean, the politicians, civil society, everybody except the Conservatives at the founding meeting, the SNP were there as well, saying, we cannot have this anymore.
Most people agreed that the system for funding local authorities across the UK was unfair, unpopular, and ripe for reform. The tax you were charged, called the rates, was based on the value of your house and not on your ability to pay. Scottish local authorities had been required by law to carry out a re-evaluation of house values. In other words, many people, especially if they lived in a big house, were about to be faced with a big tax hike.
There had been a revaluation of rating, which itself seemed to be grossly unfair, And the government was under intense pressure, and particularly the Scottish office was under intense pressure from within Scotland to do something about it.
The Tories had the solution, a flat rate tax. Everyone would pay the same. They called it the community charge. Everyone else called it the poll tax.
Margaret Thatcher was captivated by the story of the wee Scots wifey, the widow living at home in a big house, who was going to be hit by the revaluation and was going to be paying disproportionately more. And Margaret Thatcher thought of this sort of, Sunday Post reading lady in Crieff and thought how unfair it should be that she should have worked hard all her life and now be hit by this particular tax. The poll tax seems to be fairer to me, and it's certainly something that the Scottish Party are asking me to do in order to resolve this problem. Fair enough. This is a Scottish solution to a Scottish problem. A sign, actually, that I'm taking seriously the need to be sensitive. And so for reasons that are, if you're prepared to be fair to her, entirely understandable, she and the Scottish Conservative Party made a catastrophic political mistake.
The coincidence of that rates re-evaluation was the reason that the poll tax came to Scotland a year early. The Scottish Tory leadership had pressed for it to be brought. They thought it would be popular, a vote winner. But Scotland, already nursing a powerful grievance, didn't see it that way. For the poll tax, a year early, played straight into Scotland's now well-entrenched sense of its own victimhood.
What was so nauseating and